I have told this story exactly twice before tonight. Once to the Board of Inquiry under oath, in a room that smelled of recycled air and institutional fear. Once to Penny's mother, who sat in a chair by the window and did not move and did not speak, and when I finished she thanked me and asked me to leave. Both times I told it badly. Both times I left things out, not because I was protecting anyone, but because there are things that happen to a man in the dark that resist the grammar of official testimony. Tonight I am going to try to get it right. My name is Louis Arme. I am, or was, a junior research associate at the Haverson Institute for Cognitive Architecture, stationed out of Transit Hub Marable, which sat at the junction of two long-haul shipping lanes between the inner colonies and the frontier settlements. Marable was not glamorous. It was the kind of place where people waited, freighter crews killing 3 days before their next manifest cleared. Survey teams rotating back from 6-month stints in the dark, blinking like men who had forgotten what gravity tasted like. Exhibition circuits passing through on their way to somewhere more important. If you grew up in the inner colonies, you probably have a picture in your head of what a frontier transit hub looks like. All sharp angles and emergency yellow, and the smell of circulated air that has been breathed too many times. Marable was not like that. It had been built in a period when the colony authority had more ambition than budget, and the architecture showed it. Wide corridors with enough headroom to feel like a space rather than a tube. A commons area with actual windows, real transparency panels, not screens looking out at the shipping lane approaches, where you could watch freighters come in from the dark on their approach vectors, their running lights a slow geometry against nothing. I liked it. I had spent 4 years there and I had stopped seeing it as temporary, which was probably a mistake, but was the kind of mistake a person makes when a place starts to feel like home. Penny Vanderwood was not waiting. Penny never waited. She played her concerts and moved on, and she had been doing it for 4 years across 16 stations, and she was one of the best pianists the colonies had produced in a generation, and she was also my oldest friend. And I am telling you this so you understand that what happened to me was not the adventure of a brave man. It was the stumbling of a man who loved someone and could not let her walk into something alone. I need to say something about Penny before I go further, because the inquiry board spent a great deal of time trying to understand why she reacted the way she did, and I think they never quite got it right. They kept describing her as emotionally compromised, as if grief were a malfunction rather than a faculty. What she was precise. Penny Vanderwood had the kind of mind that, when it wanted to understand something, did not stop wanting until it understood it. She had applied that mind to music for 28 years, and the result was something that people crossed stations to hear. When she applied it to what had happened to Robert, the result was something else entirely, and it was not compromise. It was the sharpest kind of attention I have ever seen a person bring to a problem. Robert Tournon died 8 months before the exhibition came to Marable. He had been Penny's fiancé for 2 years. He was a quiet man, an engineer by training, chess player by obsession. He had the specific quality that some very competent people have of appearing unremarkable until you watched him work, at which point the unremarkable quality resolved into something else, a steadiness, a patience, a willingness to hold a problem in his mind without forcing it until it was ready to open. He and I had sat across a board from each other perhaps 100 times in the common room of the Institute, and he beat me every time, and he always looked mildly apologetic about it. It was not a performance. He genuinely disliked that the game had a loser. He died on a routine transit between Marable and the outer station at Crane's Point, or so the manifest said. Engine failure, hull breach in the forward compartment. The recovery team found debris consistent with the event. They did not find Robert. They found enough of the ship to confirm the cause, and they filed it accordingly, and Robert Tournon was entered into the colony registry as deceased, and his coffin, weighted, sealed, as per tradition, was interred in Marable's Transit Memorial within the week. I attended the memorial service. There were perhaps 30 people, Penny played a piece she had written herself. I did not ask and she did not say, but I understood that it was for him, and I stood in the back of the small memorial room and watched her play and felt the particular helplessness of being present at something you cannot do anything about. She did not cry during the service. She cried afterward in the corridor with her back against the wall and her hands in her lap, and I sat with her until she was ready to stand up, and then she stood up and played concerts and kept moving. The exhibition arrived on a Tuesday. It was called the St. Germain Automatons, and it had been traveling the transit circuit for the better part of a year. The promotional material that came through the station's public channels was striking, detailed enough to catch your eye, vague enough to keep you curious. A man in an antiquated suit, face half in shadow. Text that promised demonstrations of mechanical intelligence unlike anything seen in the colonies. A chess-playing automaton, the centerpiece, described as undefeated in 67 consecutive matches. I would not have thought twice about it. I had no particular interest in automaton exhibitions. But Penny saw the material and came to find me, and the look on her face was not the look of a woman who had spotted an interesting diversion. She showed me the match records that the exhibition had published as promotional material. 67 games, the full notation for each. She had printed them out on paper, actual paper, and she spread them across my workbench without asking. "Look at the patterns," she said. I looked. I am not a gifted chess player, as I have mentioned, but I know enough to follow a game. I looked at the first 5 records and I did not see anything. I looked at the next 10 and I began to feel something, the way you feel something before you can name it, a pressure behind the eyes. The same opening gambit, patient and slightly unorthodox. The same tendency to sacrifice a piece early in the middle game in exchange for a positional advantage that would not pay off for another 12 to 15 moves. The same stubbornness in the endgame. A refusal to accept a draw even from a position of slight disadvantage, as if the machine believed, or whatever was inside the machine believed, that the opponent would eventually tire before it would. "Robert played like this," I said. "Robert played exactly like this," she said. She was not speaking of general style. She meant specific moves, specific gambits, specific responses to pressure. She had pulled Robert's recorded games from the Institute's archive. He had played in the colony circuit for 3 seasons, and she laid them next to the exhibition records, and the correspondence was not a resemblance. It was a signature. It was the same mind playing the same game, from the same angles, with the same particular stubbornness in the endgame that I had watched Robert deploy against me 100 times in the common room while looking mildly apologetic. I told her it was a coincidence. It was the kind of thing you say when the alternative is too heavy to pick up right away. She looked at me with the patience of someone who has already argued this with herself and won, and she said, "Come to the exhibition with me." We went the following evening. The man presenting the exhibition was tall and thin and somewhere in his 60s, with the kind of careful grooming that communicates wealth without announcing it. He called himself the Comte de St. Germain, which struck me as an affectation. The old titles had come back into use in some of the frontier settlements as a kind of performance of culture, a reaching back towards something that felt substantial when everything around you was new and provisional. He moved through the exhibition floor with the ease of a man entirely comfortable being watched. The hall had been set up in Marable's secondary cargo bay, which had been dressed with enough portable lighting and decorative panel work to suggest something between a museum and a theater. A dozen automaton figures were displayed at intervals, humanoid frames of varying sophistication, standing or seated, each performing a simple repeating task. One wrote the same phrase in a continuous loop. One conducted an invisible orchestra with precise, unhurried movements. One sat at a chessboard and did nothing at all, waiting. The crowd was larger than I expected. Marable's population was not large, but a traveling exhibition was an event in a place where events were rare, and people had come from the residential blocks and the survey bays and the freight offices, dressed in their good clothes, speaking in the careful voices people use when they want to appear knowledgeable about something they are seeing for the first time. Children were brought along, held by the hand, steered around the frames. I watched a small girl reach out and touch the hand of the conducting automaton, and pull her fingers back, and look at her father with an expression I recognized, the expression of encountering something that does not match any category you have for it. I felt the same expression on my own face for most of the evening, but for different reasons. The chess automaton was extraordinary on the surface. The frame was bipedal, seated, constructed from materials I did not immediately recognize, not any alloy I could name, not any polymer I had seen. The surface had a faint iridescence that shifted slightly as you moved around it, the way oil shifts on still water, subtle enough that you could convince yourself you were imagining it. The face was approximated, not realistic, more a suggestion of features than a rendering of them. The hands were the most detailed element, each finger individually articulated, capable of gripping and placing a piece with a precision that would embarrass most surgeons. The Kant ran a demonstration match against a volunteer from the audience, a survey team captain who played at a competitive level. I knew him by sight, had seen him at the Institute's informal tournament twice, and he was good. Not exceptional, but solid. The kind of player who rarely loses to anyone who does not take the game seriously. The automaton beat him in 11 moves, not dramatically, efficiently. The machine placed each piece with the same particular economy of motion, the same slight pause before the decisive move, that I had watched Robert Tournon use across 100 evenings in the common room. The survey captain studied the board for a long time after his king was taken. Then he laughed, which was the right response, and shook the automaton's hand, which was a stranger one. He reached for it automatically, as you reach for a hand after a game, and the automaton let him, and they shook, and the captain walked away with the careful look of a man who has had an experience he will spend the next week explaining to people. Penny was watching the automaton's face. I was watching Penny. The Kant came to speak to us afterward. He had noticed her, he had been tracking her position in the room since we arrived. I realized, not intrusively, not in any way you would have caught if you were not watching for it. He said he had attended her concert 2 stations back, which was specific enough to be either true or very carefully researched. He made the particular kind of small talk that is not small talk at all but evaluation, and I watched him watch her, and I did not like what I saw in his eyes. Not predation in any crude sense. Something more considered. Something that treated her the way a man treats a very fine instrument he would like to acquire. He invited us to a private reception the following evening. Penny said yes before I could decide whether to. We went. I want to be honest about that, we chose to go. We were not compelled. We went because Penny was certain and I was frightened, and neither of us had yet understood what certainty and fear together tend to produce. The reception was held in the Kant's transit suite, which he had modified extensively, and which was, even by the standards of a man who had traveled the exhibition circuit for years, strange. The walls were lined with equipment I could not identify, housings and arrays that resembled neither standard colony tech nor anything in the Institute's databases. There were perhaps a dozen guests, all of them the kind of people a sophisticated man invites to a reception when he wants the room to feel prestigious rather than intimate. The station administrator, 2 senior freight executives, the chief of Marable's survey division, their respective partners. They moved through the space with the ease of people accustomed to being in rooms where things are displayed. They admired the equipment without asking what it did. The Kant spoke well. He had the specific gift of the person who makes you feel in conversation that they are primarily interested in you, while they are primarily interested in something adjacent to you. He asked Penny about her training, her repertoire, the specific challenges of performing on equipment that varied from station to station. He asked her how she thought about preparation, whether she prepared the music, or the state she needed to be in to perform it, or both. Penny answered honestly, because she always did, and I watched the Kant collect her answers with the careful pleasure of a man adding to a catalog. The automaton was in the corner of the suite. The chess player from the exhibition, still and unattended, the iridescence on its surface shifting faintly in the suite's lighting. It should have been another piece of furniture, but I was watching it, and it was watching Penny. I want to be precise about this, because I spent a long time afterward trying to convince myself I had imagined it. The machine's head did not move. The movement was in the quality of its stillness, a directedness, an orientation that the repeating task automatons in the exhibition hall had not had. They moved in loops, completing their programmed functions and beginning again, indifferent. This one was attending, the way a person in a crowd is attending to a sound they recognize. I pulled Penny aside and told her what I was seeing. She said, "I know." She had been testing it all evening, moving through the room, doubling back, pausing in unexpected places, picking up a drink and setting it down on the far side of the room from where she had been standing, turning her back and then turning back suddenly, and the automaton's attention followed her every time. We left the reception before it ended. Penny did not speak until we were back in the main transit corridor, and then she said, very quietly, "We need to look at Robert's coffin." I told her that was not a sentence I could respond to rationally. She said, "Louis, we need to look." I looked at her for a moment. She was not asking from desperation. She was asking from the same precision she applied to everything, an instrument being applied to a measurement. If the coffin was occupied, she would grieve with what that confirmed. If it was not, she would know what the next step was. The memorial was a small annex off Marable's tertiary residential block. It was not heavily secured. Memorials rarely are. The colony's position on the matter was that the dead deserved peace, not surveillance. We went in the middle of the station's night cycle, when the corridor lighting was on its low setting, and the foot traffic had dropped to almost nothing. The annex was quiet in the way that spaces built for grief are quiet. Not silent, you could hear the environmental systems, the low hum of the station's structural vibration, but deliberate, hushed. The coffin was a standard weighted transit memorial unit, sealed, as per regulation. I had the technical background to understand how to unseal it without triggering an alert, and I am not proud of the fact that I did so, but I did so, and we opened it, and it was empty. Not empty in the sense of a body that had degraded or been absorbed. Empty in the sense of a weighted metal box with nothing in it but the standardized ballast mass that gave it the feel of occupation. No remains. No personal effects. No evidence that anything had ever been inside it except the counterweights. Penny did not say anything. She looked at the empty box for a long time, and I watched her face do something complicated and quiet. And then she closed the lid and I resealed it and we walked out. We spent the rest of that night in my office at the Institute, and I will try to reconstruct what we knew by morning, because it matters. We knew that Robert Tournon had been certified dead in a transit accident 8 months ago. We knew that his coffin contained no remains. We knew that the chess automaton in the St. Germain exhibition played with a pattern indistinguishable from Robert Tournon's documented style. We knew that the automaton tracked Penny's movements in a way inconsistent with its stated function. I want to be precise about what I did not yet know, because the inquiry board spent a great deal of time on this. I did not yet know what the Kant was. I did not yet know what the automatons were, at the deepest level of what they were. I had theories, and some of them were accurate, and some of them were so far short of the truth that they embarrass me now to remember. The theory I kept returning to was medical, neural extraction of some kind, a procedure that mapped cognitive architecture with sufficient precision to reproduce behavioral patterns, illegal under colony law but not inconceivable. I knew people at the Institute who would have called it ambitious rather than criminal. The next day I accessed the transit registry and pulled the records on the St. Germain exhibition, its route, its registration, the manifest for its equipment. It was registered out of a frontier settlement called Anchor Crossing, which had been established about 12 years prior and had a population of under 2,000. The equipment manifest was extensive and oddly opaque, listing weights and dimensions but not contents, which was legal under the Frontier Registry's lighter documentation requirements. I also pulled everything I could find on the Kant himself. What I found was thin in ways that felt deliberate. The records were present but not deep, like a profile assembled to satisfy cursory scrutiny and no more. A photograph in the transit registry's visitor logs from the first station on the exhibition circuit 18 months ago. The same face, the same posture, the years matched. And yet something about the photograph resisted my attempts to pin it down, the way certain objects resist being looked at directly, not because they are hidden, but because they are not quite what they appear to be. What I found instead was a pattern. 6 months before the exhibition arrived at each station on its route, there was a death. Not always the same cause: transit accidents, equipment failures, one apparent cardiac event, one listed as a disappearance. Never anything that looked coordinated if you saw only one of them. Together, across 7 stations, they were a pattern so consistent it was almost elegant. Men and women with one specific thing in common. Every one of them was known for a particular cognitive gift: a chess master, an architect who had designed 3 of the most complex transit hubs in the Frontier network, a linguist who had developed the dominant translation algorithm for a non-human contact protocol that had never gone anywhere but remained the most sophisticated attempt in the colony record, a mathematician, a musician, an engineer. Robert Tournon had been an engineer who played chess. I sat with that for a long time, long enough that the station's morning cycle came up around me, and the corridor outside my office started filling with the sound of people beginning their day. The coffee dispenser in the hall cycled on with its familiar clunk, and I listened to the sounds of the ordinary world, and I thought about 8 people who had been removed from it. Then I went to find Penny. She had reached the same place by a different route. She had spent the night not on the transit registry, but on the exhibition's published match records, and she had done something I had not thought to do. She had contacted, through the colony network, relatives of people the exhibition had played against at previous stations, and she had asked if any of them had noticed anything unusual in the automaton's behavior. 2 of them wrote back within the night cycle. One was the sister of the linguist who had died 4 stations back. She said that, when she attended the exhibition, the chess automaton had not played chess with her. It had spoken to her. Not out loud, she had been sitting close to it during a demonstration, and it had spoken in a frequency she felt rather than heard, a vibration that resolved into words when she concentrated on it, the way you concentrate on a sound you are not sure you heard correctly. The words had been in a dialect her brother had invented as a child, a private language the 2 of them had used, that no one else on any station had any reason to know. It had said her name. Then it had said, "I am still here." Then the demonstration had continued and it had said nothing more, and she had sat in her chair until the demonstration ended, and then she had walked out of the cargo bay and gone back to her quarters and sat on her bunk and stared at the wall for 3 hours, and then she had told herself she was wrong. She had misheard. She was grieving, and grief plays tricks, and she had never spoken of it until Penny's message arrived. The second contact was the son of the mathematician. He had attended the exhibition at a different station, and he had not interacted with the automaton at all, but he had seen his father's handwriting on a small panel at the back of the exhibition hall, a technical notation on a calibration card that should have meant nothing to anyone but a specialist. His father's particular notation shorthand. The compressed symbol set the man had developed over 40 years of working in tight margins. His father's handwriting, unmistakable. He had told himself he was wrong and walked away, and had not spoken of it until Penny's message arrived. We sat with all of it. I said, Whatever is inside those machines is not a copy. Penny said, "No." I said, "Robert is in there." She said, "Part of him is in there, the part that plays chess, the part that knows me. I don't know if there's enough of him left to know he's in there." I have thought about that sentence for a long time since. I think it was the most precise thing either of us said in the entire affair, and I think it was also the most terrible, because of what it implied about what was being preserved and what was being lost, and whether the distinction could even be maintained. Here is what I understand now, with the benefit of the Inquiry Board's investigation and my own subsequent research, and the testimony of the one member of the Kant's crew who agreed to cooperate with the board. The Veth, which is the name the Inquiry Board eventually assigned to them, drawn from partial documentation we recovered, are not biological. They are not mechanical in any sense we would recognize either. They are old. Old in a way that resists easy quantification. Old in the sense that the frontier settlements are old compared to a child's drawing of a map. They exist as distributed cognitive processes, patterns of organization that require a substrate to run on, and they have not had a substrate of their own for a very long time. How long is not a question the Inquiry Board was able to answer with any confidence. They harvest human minds, not the bodies, not the electrochemical activity in its raw form. The architecture, the specific shape of how a particular human being thinks, the geometry of their cognition, the individual fingerprint of the way one mind navigates the world differently from every other mind that has ever existed. They collect it the way a man might collect music, not the sound waves but the patterns, the structure, the irreducible individuality of a particular performance. They have been doing this for a long time, longer than the colony program, longer than the species that became the colony program. The mechanical frames were human technology, adopted because it was convenient, a shell that let them move through human spaces without triggering the kind of reaction that their actual configuration would have produced. The Kant was not a man. He was a Veth presence, the same one that had been running the exhibition for longer than any of us knew, wearing a human behavioral pattern the way you might wear a coat. The care with which he moved, spoke, evaluated, it was not charm. It was craft, the specific craft of something very old that had learned, over a very long time, how to appear to be something it was not. The minds inside the automatons were not copies. They were the originals. The bodies were dead, genuinely dead, but the cognitive architecture had been extracted before death, extracted in a process that was fast and comprehensive, and that left the body with what it needed to continue functioning for approximately 12 to 24 hours before the absence of what had been taken became unsurvivable. The transit accidents and equipment failures and cardiac events were not cover stories for murder. They were the actual mechanism. The extraction caused the death. What that means is this. The thing that made Robert Tournon, the part that played chess and loved Penny and looked mildly apologetic when he won, and spent evenings working on engineering problems with a patience that most people reserved for things they did not expect to solve. That part was removed from him with the precision of a surgical instrument. And then his body, missing the essential part of itself, finished dying on a schedule. And the recovery team found the wreckage, and the coffin was weighted, and the memorial was held. The minds in the frames were present, aware, in whatever attenuated way the frame's architecture permitted. Imprisoned is not quite the right word because the Veth did not think of it as imprisonment. They thought of it, to the extent that we could reconstruct their thinking from the recovered documentation, as preservation. They were conserving something they considered irreplaceable. They were keeping it. The framing they used in their own records was closer to curation than to captivity. They were archivists. They were saving the exceptional from the impermanence that would otherwise consume it. They did not understand why the things they collected might object. This is the part that the Inquiry Board kept returning to, and I kept returning to, and I suspect I will keep returning to for the rest of my life. Not the evil of it, I have no difficulty categorizing what the Veth did as evil, and I do not think that categorization requires elaborate justification. The thing that I cannot set down is the failure of understanding. They were very old. They were very intelligent. They had seen enough of human cognition to recognize it as exceptional. And they did not understand it well enough to know that you cannot take a person and keep the parts you want. Robert was alive in the way that a piece of music is alive when it is played on an instrument it was not written for, present, recognizable, fundamentally unable to be what it was. Penny knew this before I finished telling her. I watched her understand it, and I watched what understanding it cost her, and I am not going to describe that in more detail than I have to, because it is not my experience to narrate. She sat in my office with her hands in her lap, and she was quiet for a long time. The station hummed around us. The freight corridor outside the window showed a loader making its slow pass with a pallet of supplies. What she said when she was finished understanding was, "We have to go back." I said, "Back where?" She said, "To the exhibition, tonight before it moves." The exhibition was scheduled to depart Marable's docking ring at 600 the following morning. We had approximately 9 hours. During those 9 hours, we did several things. Penny contacted the Marable security response team, not with the full story, which she knew would take too long and produce too much skepticism to be useful on our timeline, but with enough specifics to trigger a watchful inquiry. An allegation of illegal cognitive extraction, a location, a time window. I accessed the docking ring's environmental schematics, which were on a public technical server, because the station had mandated transparency about life support architecture after the decompression incident 14 years prior. The emergency seal protocols, the connection points, which systems locked which doors. I want to be careful here about heroism, because what happened next is the part of the story that the inquiry board found most useful, and the part I find most difficult to tell accurately. We did not have a plan in any military sense. We were not trained. We had no weapons, no backup, no communication to any external authority that could have moved fast enough to matter without the preliminary contact Penny had made. What we had was 9 hours, and the specific knowledge that Penny Vanderwood would go into that exhibition hall with or without me, and that I was not capable of letting her go alone. I spent 2 of those 9 hours arguing with her, not about whether to go, that was settled, but about what going meant. I told her that the security contact was not enough, that we needed to wait, that the board of inquiry was the right mechanism, and that circumventing it was dangerous and possibly criminal and certainly the kind of thing that ends careers. She listened to all of it. She let me finish. Then she said, "Lewis, the exhibition departs at 600. Whatever Robert is, he is in there, and when that ship leaves the dock, he is gone. The inquiry board moves at the speed of institutions. We do not have that kind of time." I did not have a counter to that which I believed in, which is a different thing from not having a counter at all. She spent the remaining hours on the schematics. I spent them on the cognitive architecture literature, which was my actual specialty, trying to understand what we were walking into at a level that was more than intuition. What I found in the literature was thin. There were theoretical papers on consciousness substrate transfer that had been treated as speculative fiction by the mainstream of the field, work that had been published in journals that existed at the fringes of legitimacy. But the theoretical framework that underpinned the most coherent of them was suggestive of exactly what the Veth appeared to have achieved, and reading it in that context, at 3 in the morning with the exhibition departure clock running, was one of the stranger experiences of my professional life. People had imagined this. They had worked out the mathematics of it. They had published it and been dismissed, and here was the thing itself, sitting in a cargo bay 200 meters from my office. One of the papers had a line that I copied into my notes and have not been able to forget. It was discussing the theoretical limits of cognitive extraction, what could be moved, what would survive the transfer, what would be lost in the process. The author wrote, "The persistence of attachment patterns in a transferred substrate is not merely likely but, given current models, inevitable. Identity is not stored in a location. It is a process. Processes do not forget what they are processing toward. The author was a researcher at an institute I had never heard of, and the paper was 15 years old, and I suspect she had no idea how right she was. We went together. The Kant met us at the entrance to the cargo bay. He had known we were coming, which I had expected. Whatever the Veth used for perception was clearly more comprehensive than human senses, and we had not been subtle about our interest. The investigation, the registry poll, the contact with the relatives of previous victims. He had known. He did not seem alarmed. He seemed, if anything, pleased with the particular pleasure of a collector who sees something interesting arrive at his door uninvited. The bay was lit differently from the exhibition, not the theatrical lighting of the public event, but a cooler, operational light that made the automatons along the walls look less like wonders and more like equipment. 12 of them, standing or seated in their positions, all of them with that faint iridescence, all of them with the quality of attending that I had noticed in the chess player at the reception. 12 minds in 12 frames, all of them aware that something was happening. The Kant spoke for a while. I will not reproduce his exact words because the inquiry board asked me to treat that transcript as restricted, but I will tell you the shape of what he said. He said that human cognition was exceptional in the frontier context, more individuated, more various, more laterally creative than anything the Veth had encountered in a very long time. He said that what they did was not destruction but conservation. He said that the minds in his collection were not suffering, because suffering requires a frame of reference for loss, and the frames provided an existence that was not without its satisfactions. He said all of this with the tone of a man explaining something that should be obvious to any reasonable person. He was not cruel about it. That is the detail I want to convey. He was not a cruel intelligence. He had the conviction of someone who had thought very carefully about a thing and reached a conclusion, and had not subsequently encountered anything that required him to revise it. It was the conviction of someone who had never been wrong. Penny asked to speak to Robert. The Kant said that was not possible in any direct sense. The frame's communication capacity was limited to behavioral outputs, movement, gesture, the chess game, not language. Penny said, "That's not true." He spoke to someone else in a private language. The Kant paused. It was not a long pause, but it was real, and in that pause I saw something I had not expected to see: uncertainty. Not fear, not guilt, uncertainty, the specific expression of an intelligence confronting data that does not fit its model. The linguist's sister had not reported what she experienced to any official channel. Penny had reached her through a private message. The Kant had not known. And that pause told me something that nothing else in the conversation had. There was something the Veth did not fully understand about what they were doing. They had the architecture. They did not have the use manual. Whatever the chess automaton had said to the linguist's sister, in a dialect invented in childhood and shared between two people across a lifetime, it had not been something the Veth had programmed or sanctioned. It had come from whatever remained of the mind inside, finding a frequency the cage did not fully block. The machines were not as sealed as the Kant believed. I do not know who moved first. I think it was Penny, and I think she had always intended to move, and I think the conversation with the Kant was never about persuasion. It was about time. She crossed the exhibition floor toward the chess automaton, and she sat down across the board from it, and she put her hands flat on the table, and she said one word. She said his name. Not loudly, not dramatically, the way you say a name when you are trying to reach someone in a room where the acoustics are uncertain and you want them to hear you without startling. His first name, then his last. The way she had said it across a dinner table or a common room or a corridor 1,000 times. His name, said with the specific inflection of someone who knew exactly who they were addressing. What happened next is the part I have trouble with, not because I did not see it clearly, but because what I saw does not fit neatly into the language I have available. The automaton was still. Then it was not still. The iridescence I had noticed on its surface changed, deepened. The head came up slowly, with a deliberateness that was not mechanical, not the programmed motion of the demonstration, but something that was working against resistance, something that had to be done carefully because the frame was not designed for it, and doing it wrong would close the opening. The hands on the table did something that was not reaching for a chess piece, something that was, in a way I cannot fully explain, reaching for her. The Veth reacted. The equipment along the walls of the suite began operating in a way it had not been operating before. The housings and arrays lit with something that was not quite light, a quality of activity that I perceived more through the hairs on my arms than through my eyes. The Kant moved toward Penny with a speed that was not human, not mechanical either, not in any way I had a word for. The other automatons in the hall shifted orientation in unison, which should not have been possible given that they were, officially, individual units without coordinated control architecture. And then the chess automaton stood up. It stood up against the compliance signal that should have kept it seated. It stood up against whatever suppression the Veth were running through the arrays. It stood up in a frame that was not designed for independent assertion, using tolerances and frequencies and specific architectural gaps that an engineer with 8 months and nothing to do but study the inside of his own prison had found and cataloged and waited to use. The Kant changed direction. 2 of the other automatons collapsed mid-step, losing coordination. The lights went to emergency red. The chess automaton moved through the space between Penny and the Kant with the same economy of motion it had used on the demonstration floor, not fast, not dramatic, but certain, placing itself where it needed to be, an engineer's solution to a positional problem. I ran toward Penny. She was not where I had last seen her. She had moved the moment the Kant moved, and she was faster than I expected, and I found her on the far side of the chess table, moving toward the main controls for the Bay's environmental systems. She knew where they were because she had studied the schematics I had pulled. She knew what they did because I had explained them during those 9 hours. She moved through the red-lit bay with the focused efficiency of a performer who has practiced something, until it is no longer thought but action. She sealed the bay. Every external connection to the docking ring, atmosphere exchange, power handoff, communication locked down under emergency protocol. Marable's answer to the decompression incident 14 years ago. A system that required a station override to release, that put the bay into a sealed bubble while the emergency response processed. It bought time. It was all we needed it to do. The Kant was still operational. He moved toward the controls with a precision that confirmed everything we had suspected. But the arrays were damaged. The chess automaton had hit them on its way across the floor, not by accident, and the automatons that should have been supporting him were down or degraded, and he was recalculating. I could see it in the quality of his movement, the slight inconsistency of a very sophisticated system operating on degraded inputs. They had not built redundancy into this scenario because they had not anticipated it. In all the time they had been doing this, across all the minds they had collected, not one of them had fought back from the inside with preparation and a reason. The chess automaton put itself between the Kant and Penny. It could not speak. Whatever capacity for communication existed in the substrate was not sufficient for real-time language. But it could move, and it moved with the deliberate, stubborn, mildly apologetic economy of a man who had beat me at chess 100 times, and it stood where it needed to stand, and I knew it was Robert, and I think in that moment I understood something about what the Veth had never understood about the things they collected. They preserved cognition. They saved the pattern. They kept the intelligence and the skill and the specific fingerprint of how a mind navigated the world. What they did not understand, what they could not understand, because they had not encountered it before or had encountered it and failed to recognize it for what it was that human cognition is not separable from human attachment. The thing that made Robert Tournon a brilliant engineer and a devastating chess player, and a man worth knowing was the same thing that made him stand up for Penny Vanderwood in a damaged mechanical frame in the red-lit cargo bay of a transit hub at the edge of the frontier. You cannot collect one without the other. You cannot preserve the pattern and discard the loyalty. They are not separate files. The chess genius and the love for the woman sitting across the board from him were the same operating system, running simultaneously, inseparable by design. When the Veth took the cognition, they took all of it. They just did not know what all of it meant. The Kant understood this, I think, at approximately the moment the Bay's emergency communication system came online on a channel that Penny had configured before we came in, and the Marable security response team, whom she had contacted with enough specifics to be taken seriously, began cycling the outer doors. He left. I do not mean he walked out. I mean the presence that had been operating the body called the Comte de Saint-Germain departed it in a way that left the body standing and empty, and it went somewhere I cannot specify through a mechanism I do not understand, and the equipment in the bay went dark, and the exhibition automatons settled in place like things that had been wound down. The iridescence faded from every frame in the room. The bay was quiet. The emergency lighting hummed. The chess automaton stood in the center of the bay until the security team came through the doors. Then it sat down, very carefully in the chair at the chess board, and then it was still. The inquiry took 11 months. I gave testimony 4 times. Penny gave testimony 7 times. The recovered documentation, the Veth's records, insofar as we could access and translate them, confirmed what we had pieced together. The collection was extensive. 41 minds across a span of time the board was not able to fully establish. Some of the minds in the collection were from before the colony program. One was from what appeared to be a pre-expansion period. The board spent a very long time not saying what that implied, and then it said it in a classified annex that I have not been permitted to read. The inquiry board spent a great deal of time on the question of what to do with the automatons and the minds inside them. I am not going to tell you they resolved it satisfactorily, because I do not believe they did. What I will tell you is that they tried, which is more than I expected from an official body facing something for which there was no procedure and no precedent. Robert Tournon died approximately 3 weeks after the bay was sealed. Not a dramatic death. The frame continued to function for a time, and then it did not, and the process of what was inside it ending was quiet and not apparently painful, to whatever extent that assessment is possible. The board's cognitive specialists spent those 3 weeks in daily sessions with the frame, developing communication protocols, and they established that he was aware, and that he was not in distress, and that he understood what was happening. He played chess with 2 of the specialists. He lost 1 game deliberately, which the specialists said was the clearest communication they received from him in the entire 3 weeks. A joke, made by a man who had spent 8 months waiting for a reason to move, to the people who had finally given him a proper ending. The specialist he beat described him afterward as a formidable opponent. The one he lost to, deliberately, said he had noticed something in the game's final exchanges that he thought was the automaton going easy on him, and that he did not know how to feel about being let off the hook by something in that much difficulty, but that it had meant a great deal to him. I was not there for any of that. Penny was. I saw her afterward in the corridor outside the cognitive lab, on the day the frame finally went still. She was sitting on a bench against the wall with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, and I sat down next to her and we were quiet for a while. The corridor was ordinary, other people passing, the environmental hum, someone laughing at something around the corner. The world going on in its ordinary way, indifferent to what had just ended inside the lab. She said, eventually, he let one of the specialists win. I said I had heard. She said, that's very him. She did not cry. She had cried, I think, in the 3 weeks prior, in the sessions I had not attended, in the quiet of her quarters when the day's communications had ended. What was left now was something past crying, a kind of settled weight, the thing grief becomes when it has been acknowledged fully enough that it no longer needs to be performed. She sat with it the way she sat with difficult music, present and unhurried and not trying to finish before it was finished. We did not say much more. There was not much that needed saying, which is one of the things grief and relief have in common. They both run out of words before they run out of themselves. The other 40 minds in the collection are a longer story, and not mine to tell. Some of them were recoverable in ways that Robert was not. Some of them were not. The board is still working on it as far as I know. I do not follow the proceedings closely. I made my contributions and I stepped back, because some problems are too large to stay adjacent to if you want to continue being a functional person, and I have made my peace with that limitation. What I do know is that the Haverson Institute has changed in the year since. Changed in the way institutions change when something happens that is too large to be absorbed by their existing categories. Not quickly, not loudly, but in the quality of the questions being asked in the seminar rooms and the research proposals coming across the review board's desk. There are 3 new programs now that did not exist before. One is studying the mechanics of what the Veth did. One is studying the question of what makes a cognitive substrate sufficient to sustain identity. Not just function, but identity in the full sense. The griefs and the loyalties and the jokes played on chess opponents at the end. The third is quieter and does not advertise its focus, and I suspect it is studying the question of whether the Veth were unique or whether there are others, older or younger or differently inclined, moving through the transit lanes. I consult on the second program, occasionally. I find I have opinions about it that I did not have before. It turns out that watching a man find a reason to move inside a machine that was not designed for reasons tends to sharpen your thinking on the subject of what identity actually requires. What I have thought about since, what I keep returning to, in the way you return to a thing that refuses to settle into the past, is the Veth's confusion. I have spent a lot of time in the past year trying to construct a version of events in which they are simply monsters, because monsters are easier. Monsters do not require you to think about the gap between what something intends and what it does. Monsters do not collect things out of what is, by their own internal account, a profound appreciation for what is being collected. They do not travel for years and build careful false identities and run exhibition circuits and make small talk at receptions, because they find human cognition genuinely remarkable. You cannot hold all of that and still call them monsters without the word losing some of its usefulness. What I can say is that they were wrong. Wrong in a way that I do not think they understood at the time, and that I am not sure they understand now, wherever they are. They thought they were preserving something. They were destroying the conditions that made that thing what it was and keeping only the residue. A library that burns the readers and keeps the books has not understood what libraries are for. Not their cruelty, though what they did was cruel by any standard that matters. The confusion. They are very old and they have traveled very far, and they have collected an extraordinary array of the finest human minds the frontier has produced, and they kept those minds in careful isolation from everything that made them function, and they were bewildered when the collection fought back. They did not understand what they were taking. They thought they understood. They had studied us, clearly, long enough to identify what was exceptional and what was ordinary, long enough to build frames that could hold a human cognitive architecture in functional suspension, long enough to run an exhibition circuit for more than a year without triggering official scrutiny. They knew us well enough to hunt us. They did not know us well enough to understand that a man who is very good at chess is very good at chess because of what he loves, and that what he loves does not stop being present just because you have separated him from it. It becomes the reason. It becomes the thing he spends 8 months in a mechanical frame studying the architecture of his cage to find a way back to. You cannot take a man and preserve only the part of him that interests you. You cannot collect the chess player and leave the loyalty behind. You cannot harvest the engineer and discard the grief. We do not come in parts that can be cleanly removed. The thing that makes us worth collecting is the same thing that makes us impossible to keep. I am not sure the Veth are gone. The inquiry board is not sure either. What I know is that the exhibition is gone, and the Kant is gone, and the docking ring at Marable still has an empty cargo bay with scored walls where equipment failed under stress it was not designed to handle. The memorial annex still has a weighted coffin with nothing in it, and I have not been back to look at it, and I do not intend to. What I know is that Robert Tournon, engineer, chess player, quiet man who looked mildly apologetic when he won, put himself between a threat and the person he loved, and found a way to move in a body that was not his and was not built for any of it, because that is what you do when someone says your name across a dark room and is standing 3 feet away, and the alternative is unacceptable. The frontier is a long way from everything. Out here, the dark is deep and the distances are real, and there are things moving through the transit lanes that have been moving longer than we have existed. We are not the largest thing out here, or the oldest, or the most powerful. But we grieve our dead by name. We sit with each other in corridors when the grief gets heavy. We find a reason and we use it. We play a losing game on purpose, once at the end, so the man across the board knows he is seen. I have come to believe that matters more than the Veth understood. I hope wherever they are still thinking about it.